Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus, episode 39. I am the show's host, Kyle, and coming to the end of another week here. More and more foreign policy news. It seems, to me at least, that there are a lot of maybe players on the global chessboard right now and a lot of pieces being moved around. Or maybe I'm just paying more attention now that I got the podcast and writing articles that it just seems like it because I'm reading so much more news. But it really does seem like all over the world, from West Africa all the way to North Korea, the U.S. is looking at more and more interventions all the way through. So I get, now the question is what's going to happen here? And I got a whole bunch of stories today that hopefully will shed some light for everyone on what's happening, why it's happening, and what may be the future implications of this happening. I think the Syrian war in 2013 taught us there's no real way to actually prevent a conflict from occurring, but you can get some pullback on the empire if the people don't go along with the war at the beginning, because the U.S. people pushed back so hard against bombing in Syria. Barack Obama wasn't able to bomb Assad and could only bomb ISIS, so we won kind of half the war because they're only bombing half the country, which is nice, but it's not a full win. However, no matter how unpopular the Afghan war is, and no matter how much we push and make great arguments against it, it's very hard to stop a war that's already going on, because now somebody has to lose it for it to be over. So I think this is the reason why it's so important to understand what may be happening. That way we could try to inform people and get some movement against it before it happens. Another thing I like to talk about on the show a lot is just bringing up and kind of exposing some of the unthought of and typically uncounted cost of U.S. war. And one of the costs I'm looking at today actually goes back to the Cold War. Obviously, during the Cold War, the U.S. and Russia were rushing to make a whole bunch of nukes, and in this process, they had to produce an awful lot of nuclear waste. I think the waste you have, the way you produce the nuclear weapons, you had to produce a lot of nuclear waste and a lot of really dangerous nuclear waste. And because the government, unlike a private business, really doesn't have to think of the repercussions of what we're going to do with the waste once we have it, it's just we got to build the bombs because Russia's an existential threat to the United States. And if we don't do it, then they're going to nuke us all to death. And it won't matter if there's a bunch of nuclear waste because we'll all be dead. And so I think what happened was the U.S. rushed to make all these nuclear weapons, didn't really know how to store the nuclear waste, didn't have anywhere to store the nuclear waste, and it stored it in substandard ways, and it's led to the situation. I think there's a pretty media picked up on a situation where there was a Hanford storage facility and there was a tunnel collapse there, and I guess that some of that nuclear waste is leaking from the container it's in. So the U.S. already spends $6 billion a year on maintaining nuclear waste from nuclear weapons. This is all from nuclear weapons. I'm not talking about waste produced for energy purposes. $2.3 billion of that, there's going to be a $2.3 billion increase next year. That was in the omnibus, or the spending bill that just got passed. So it looks like maybe we're going to be looking at $8.3 billion next year being spent on this, and the Hanford facility will need a total of $100 billion put into it to, I guess, secure the nuclear waste there and somehow manage that waste. So when you're factoring in the cost of war, you never anticipate the leaking containers of nuclear waste that you stick on your grandkids and make them pay for the cleanup of. Obviously, Americans today will have to pay for the cleanup of these nuclear weapons that were, passed and ratified and produced in generations before us. And so just another reason to be opposed to the interventionism in nuclear weapons and the large buildup of nuclear weapons is you're going to produce waste, and that waste will be stuck on generations coming down the road in the maintenance. And like I said, when politicians cast their votes for these weapon deals, for these wars, they never think of these costs. It's always just what's the worst possible scenario if the U.S. does nothing. Another story coming out on our nuclear weapons is that the U.S. has been able to have a pretty drastic increase in its ability to really carry out a nuclear attack against Russia. Talking about first strike capabilities. I think I brought this up on a show before what first strike capabilities are, but basically it's to say in a nuclear war that one country would be able to wipe the other country off the map before they are able to respond with nuclear weapons. I'm not completely sold on the theory of mutually assured destruction, but the idea that a country could obtain first strike capability would throw that theory out the window, because then the country could attack without, the other country guaranteeing it would be destroyed. So there are two types of nuclear weapons, and there's bigger bombs and there's smaller bombs. Per treaties with Russia, and I guess I'm sure the rest of the world like China, the U.S. has only allowed so many of the really big nuclear weapons, same as Russia, and the U.S. has allowed a smaller number of the smaller nuclear weapons. But what the U.S. has been able to do is it's been able to change the fuse that they use on the smaller nuclear weapons to allow them to be more accurate, thus more powerful and have more damage. And so part of the mutually assured destruction theory is that both Russia and the U.S. have missile silos all over the country, and these silos are very, very well protected, reinforced concrete and steel and missile defense systems and all that. With the idea that, like, if Russia were to attack the U.S., that some of these missile silos are going to survive and they're going to fire back at Russia, and that's why Russia shouldn't attack, the United States. However, if the U.S. is able to perfect the fuse and make this fuse better on the small nuclear weapon, it will allow the U.S. to use these small nuclear weapons against Russia's missile silos. And since they could use the smaller nukes on these missile silos, it's going to create a situation where the U.S. could really wipe out Russian missile silos and take out an awful large threat, an awful large piece in the mutually assured destruction theory. So this is something to keep our minds out for, because I think that the U.S. has strongly leaned in the direction of preventative wars. And the U.S. government certainly asserts that it has the power to go to war with another country if that country poses a possible threat to the United States, even if that country hasn't taken any actions that actually threaten the U.S. and may even be not retaliating, but I guess reacting to the U.S. actions that are against that country. And so I think this is a conversation that should be had, that shouldn't go on in secret, that the American people should really decide if they want to put these systems and pay for these systems that are going to allow Donald Trump presidency to wipe Russia off the map. Believing that there wouldn't be any retaliation. My concern would be that the weapons don't work quite as well as they think, or there's more missile silos, or whatever, or the U.S. missiles don't work so well. So lots of questions, but just a lot more power for the U.S. government to have over the world. I read an article by Representative Warren Davis, who's out of Ohio. The first 3 paragraphs of that article and the title of the article were absolutely excellent. The article focused on the idea that Al-Shabaab and ISIS, and really most of the Al-Nusra branches of ISIS didn't exist back when the 2001 authorization of use of military force was passed. And so it's quite obvious that for the U.S. to fight ISIS or Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Libya, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, etc., they really have no authority given to them to do so. However, the Congress just funds it and they pretend like it's some kind of deal. Of course, it's got to be completely unconstitutional. So this rep realized it, and then he said, so we need to write a new authorization of military force to allow the U.S. to conduct war, I guess, all over the globe to fight ISIS. I mean, at this point, I'm sure you could find ISIS sympathizers in probably all countries, but actual groups existing all the way from West Africa all the way to the Philippines. So are you going to declare war on the world continent, Africa, Europe, and Asia? This seems insane to me. I know the U.S. believes it's a really strong empire, but to think it could control people in that many people in that many places, it seems completely insane and a complete overstretch of our power. And so hopefully, I think the ideal scenario for some of us anti-war people would be for this to add the authorization of military force to be introduced, because I think that would mean that the current authorization of use of military force isn't sufficient to cover what the U.S. is doing today. But it's also going to force Congress to vote on war, and that's not something that's super popular among congressmen. They usually look to avoid voting on things like war, so maybe we have a situation where it gets introduced and it doesn't pass. That would be great, because then the current use of military force is delegitimized, and then the current one failed, so there's really nothing out there, and obviously the troops should be brought home. I'm positive that won't happen, but it may delegitimize the Korean, the U.S. government a little bit in their actions overseas. So that would be good. Last time on the show, I talked about, or I hope I did last time, but if not, I'll highlight the story now, that the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, are conducting airstrikes for the General Haftar in Libya. General Haftar was a general of Muammar Gaddafi's, was part of a CIA coup way back years and decades ago, and then moved into somewhere around Virginia, I believe, in the United States. Gaddafi gets killed, he returns to Libya, and then cuts a deal with Russia. So right now, the UAE is flying American-made planes on bombing missions to support the Russian-backed CIA warlord in Libya. Now, it's not like the U.S. doesn't have a dog in the fight here, because the U.S. actually and the UN back a government in the country's, I think, former capital of Tripoli. Haftar is mainly located in the other half of the country, so Tripoli would be more central west and Benghazi central east. And then there's also another government in a different Libyan city that is fairly powerful. And of course, there's Islamists running around everywhere controlling territory. So, I mean, there's a lot of different governments in Libya. However, the two of the big governments, the Haftar government and the UN-backed government, and US-backed government are fighting each other. So right now we have a US ally flying US planes against the United States in Libya. Just to add on top of this, the State Department then approves a $2 billion missile sale to the UAE. So right now we're going to sell another $2 billion in missiles to a country that's already using our own weapons against our interests overseas. I don't understand how they could get away with this, honestly. I mean, this should be so hypocritical, so blatant, so stupid, so unbelievable that every news agency is running it around the clock 24/7. That the State Department not only would if they say, hey, you gotta stop bombing for Haftar and bring those planes and at least use some different planes, don't use American-made planes, please. And then the UAE does that, then they approve the weapon sales. I mean, that's still a scandal. But the scandal here should be huge. They're actively using our own weapons against us, and then we approved to sell them 2 billion more 2 billion more missiles. It seems obviously ridiculous. Maybe some newscaster will have some courage and run the story, but I don't know. I think this is one that everybody should be spreading and saying, hey, look how stupid the United States government is. This is a reason to laugh at Trump. Hopefully something will change here, but I don't see it happening. I mean, the situation in Libya is a mess. The UAE seems to have picked their side in the fight, and the U.S. government is just going to keep selling the weapons because the military-industrial complex is full of cronies, and they, want to sell their weapons, and they believe that the Sunni alliance in the Middle East is where the U.S. needs to ally itself, and that's with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait. And nobody ever calls into question this insane foreign policy. I mean, maybe one of the reasons nobody does it is because it just seems unbelievable. It seems so stupid that nobody would ever do it. And to say that this is occurring, I think a lot of people have the same reaction to somebody who says, like, Bush planned 9/11. They're like, well, that's ridiculous on the face of it, and I'm just not going to believe it for that reason. Along with the weapon sales to the UAE, another Middle Eastern Sunni state is looking to invest $40 billion in U.S. infrastructure. Of course, Trump has famously said that he is going to introduce a $1 trillion infrastructure budget. The U.S. is broke and $20 trillion in debt. So, of course, we're not actually going to pay $1 trillion US right now for a infrastructure bill. What we're doing is we're borrowing that money so people could pay for it later, and then we're going to build the infrastructure and economics, and I'm not going to get into it on a foreign policy show, but yeah, I just want to explain that point. And so we're going to have a situation where Saudi Arabia is planning to buy a whole bunch of additional U.S. treasuries. I mean, the risk here is that this gives Saudi Arabia more political sway in the United States. in the past, when Saudi Arabia was put on the list of countries that hurt children, I believe Saudi Arabia threatened to dump U.S. treasuries at that point, and I'm not sure how much consequence that had on the decision to take Saudi Arabia off of the list. But Saudi Arabia obviously believes holding U.S. treasuries is a weapon they could use against the United States, and if they decide to dump these treasuries in the future, it would have a major impact on the U.S. economy. So it's hard to find words to explain what's happening here, where the U.S. is building infrastructure that it can't afford with blood money from Saudi Arabia. That's going to come with a much bigger bill than the $40 billion that Saudi Arabia is going to give the U.S. for down the road when they use that money to maybe have the U.S. turn a blind eye to them starving the Yemeni people, committing genocide. This could be a situation that a choice the U.S. has to make in the future. And it's completely insane to me that the U.S. would take this money, just because of where it's coming from, what an awful regime Saudi Arabia is, and how we don't want to be indebted to a bunch of people who are really committing genocide in Yemen right now. So, a story coming out of Canada, we have the Canadian military admitting that 17 of their bombs have gone off course while bombing ISIS and Syria. I don't know even how many bombs Canada has dropped, but again, with the first story I was talking about, the unthought of costs of war, one is that sometimes missiles don't work, they go short, they go long, they explode, and then they kill some civilians. And whenever you're thinking about how the U.S. has just got pinpoint accuracy bomb all the terrorists, well, that's fine, but bombs fly through the air and explode, and sometimes they don't fly the right way. And it's like nobody ever thinks of this. Nobody ever thinks that if you're going to conduct a war against ISIS, eventually you're going to blow up some children, and it is just going to happen. And I think if people understand this, if they understand that, look, for every ISIS guy you get, you're going to kill 3 children under 18. Are you okay with that? Is that a decision you're willing to make? I would hope most people would make the decision I would clearly make, which is to say, oh, well, if those are the options, right? If it's either killing children or per, ISIS fighter, or just not being involved, the answer is to not be involved. The U.S. has said that they will provide logistical, financial, and intelligence support to the 5-country West African coalition to fight Islamists. I did read that France was a major supporter of this coalition, and actually I think provides French troops to fight here. I think this is probably a clear distinction where we would have Le Pen, who may have actually decided not to pursue the backing of this coalition and just kind of back off, because she was more of a non-interventionist and bring the troops home, and bombing Syria is a bad thing. So I guess we could hope, but we got Macron, who has obviously chosen the interventionist path. I read a story about a Afghani province, Bad-Khansan, that is in the northeast of the country, is the only province in Afghanistan that borders China. Again, that is spelled Badakhstan. I looked it up online to try to figure out how to pronounce it just before I got on the show, but there are so many different pronunciations that I just went with what I thought I could say. What happened in this province was that it's very critical because it ties Afghanistan to the rest of China, who's a huge trading partner for for Afghanistan. And the Taliban nearly took this province. They drove a bunch of troops out of it, a bunch of Afghan police out of it, and there were only a few remaining fighters. And then it took a lot of U.S. air support and 600 elite Afghani fighters to go and then take that province back from the Taliban. It's funny because I read this story on Fox News, and of course it's portrayed as, oh, look at the heroic actions by the Afghani government to fight off the terrorists here. But to me, what I read was 16 years after the U.S. kicked the Taliban out of power, they came within a few soldiers of taking a very important province in Afghanistan, and so what are we doing there anyways? In fact, Dan Coates was able to echo this by saying that the things are going to get worse in Afghanistan. To be more precise, he said things are going to get worse in Afghanistan if we have a moderate amount of more intervention. I think what he was probably doing is pushing for more intervention, but he did say something right, just like Representative Warren did before, and that was that the Taliban are getting stronger and taking more ground in Afghanistan, and there's likely nothing the U.S. could do, at least for the not for the next couple of years. He said at least till 2018 it's going to get worse, and I completely agree with him. I do think that's going to be the situation. I guess the U.S. could put a couple 100,000 ground troops in Afghanistan and stop the Taliban advances, but that seems like an awfully silly thing to do. I read a story about the Syrian YPG cutting a deal with ISIS to take the town of Tabik from ISIS. There was the key dam that creates Lake Assad, the Tabika Dam, and I guess ISIS had rigged it with some explosives, so the YPG said, hey, we'll make a deal with you, you surrender and take away the bombs, then we'll come and take the city, and I guess you could leave not dead. It's interesting that a U.S. ally like the YPG would take this deal. I think it kind of goes against U.S. policy, but I just wanted to point out that the only strategy to win these battles right now is just to surround the city, besiege it until the inside people decide to give up and leave, or else you're just going to be bombing it forever. It was revealed that there is a U.S. training camp in South Syria to fight ISIS in Deir ez-Zor. This training camp includes training Syrian rebels. I'm assuming they're Arab rebels and likely Sunni Arab rebels to go up and to fight ISIS. I'm assuming that, the concern here again is just who are these people? I think it's going to come out that these people are not very good people. They're just opportunists and bad and, possibly jihadist sympathizers. I don't know, but these are questions certainly that need to be asked. So I'm hoping for more details to come with this story. The leader of this one of these groups, there were two groups that were training in South Syria, and the leader of one of the groups gave a lot of statements to the press saying that U.S. troops go out on raids with their fighters, that we provide them with weapons, very helpful, great. He loves the U.S. backing that he's getting. So that was kind of just a crazy story, because I'm guessing that the U.S. probably didn't want him to say it, but here he was praising the U.S. We have a U.S. airstrike in northern Syria killing 11 civilians. One of the notable parts of this airstrike is that it's in an area that the U.S. claims is controlled by US-backed forces. So I think it goes to show that even when ISIS is kicked out of cities, it really doesn't do anything to take them down too much. They're still going to be able to carry out attacks, and we're still going to be bombing them long after we kick them out of Mosul, Deir ez-Zor, and Raqqa. We have Turkey coming out and condemning the U.S. arming of the YPG in Syria. There's a lot to be played out with this story still, and I think there's a lot of directions it could go, so I'm not going to try to speculate too much, but it does seem like Turkey is awfully upset, and I'm guessing that Erdogan is going to take some action against the Kurds for the U.S. arming of the YPG here. And the U.S. is really saying we're going to kind of take the gloves off and allow a lot of arming of the YPG. Like I said before, eventually one of these weapons is going to kill a Turkish fighter, and then there's going to be an awful lot of questions about, of course, I'm sure the fight that the Turkish soldier will be killed and will be picked by the Turkish army itself under the direction of Erdogan. I'm hoping that we don't see too much more escalation in Syria. It does seem like the safe zones are having some impact, and so we're moving in the right direction in Syria. It would be a shame if a Turkish escalation threw that all out of bounds and screwed a lot of that up. In Yemen, in southern Yemen, there's a secessionist movement. I guess this movement is probably just to kind of end the war that's going on and saying, Houthis, you take what you have. We're in the south. We're going to take what we have. I'm sure there's going to be some areas of conflict between the two still, but it could be a much better situation than the situation we have now, especially if trade could be conducted between the two separate countries that would allow things to flow through the roads and allow aid to get to where it needs to go and allow people to get to hospitals and not be shot and shooting each other. So hopefully it happens. This is obviously against Saudi Arabia interest, because Saudi Arabia has been fighting this whole war to hold the country together. So it'd be interesting to see if the South just breaks off. The South is supported by Saudi Arabia. And the Houthis aren't awesome people either, so if Saudi Arabia bats off because the South secedes, then the Houthis may just go to war with the South without the Saudi Arabia backing. The final story I want to talk about isn't what you would think of a standard foreign policy talk, but I think it's interesting. I want to go over it. First, this big study came out saying that Mexico is the second most violent or dangerous country in the world behind Syria, and they say that there's been 23,000 homicides in Mexico in the prior year, and that this is the second highest total behind Syria. I guess the first thing is that this number just doesn't seem to me to be correct. If you look at how many people have died in violent violently in Yemen in the past year. I think Nasser Arabi says about 60,000 people have died since the conflict started 2 years ago, and so I think you're seeing like 30,000 or so dying last year in Yemen. In Afghanistan, you have 15,000 people dying just from armed conflict, so I don't think another 8,000 would be that far off to think that all those deaths occurred there. Of course, a lot of these people in Yemen and Afghanistan and other countries are dying kind of out in the middle of nowhere, and nobody really counts the deaths because they don't occur at the hospital. The UN even admits that in their numbers for Yemen, they don't count the deaths that occur outside of the hospital, so most people die under a pile of rubble or on their way to the hospital looking for help or in some remote village in Yemen, and nobody will ever count their deaths as part of the deaths from the war or the violence. And so just on this number, I think the numbers are wrong. Also, then if you count people in these countries where they were either starved to death by violence or, kidnapped and tortured and their lives ruined, or enslaved in Libya, or died in a boat trying to get from Libya to Europe or something like this. So I think if you count all those, Mexico's not so high on the list. But what we need to look at is why are so many deaths happening in Mexico, and that's obviously because of the drug trade, and most of that's because of the U.S. drug war. Americans like drugs. The American government won't allow the sale of drugs to Americans because I think maybe this is like a drug addict being against the legalization of a drug. They think if they say, oh, drugs are awful, drugs are bad, then they could kind of ignore their own hypocrisy by doing drugs on the side, or won't draw any attention to their drug use. Some insane ideas like that, right? And so this creates a gigantic black market for drugs in the United States. I think in a lot of ways just because of the way that the globe is shaped, in that Mexico is much more sparsely populated than the U.S., and there's countries in South America where there's, canopies of rainforest, and where you certainly just have more areas that black market where drug production could take place. You can't have huge marijuana fields in the United States. Somebody will definitely find it. And while people are able to, do ridiculous things like bury a bunch of train cars and grow a bunch of pot in it, most of the drugs coming into the U.S. are coming in from other countries like Afghanistan, Colombia, Mexico, and across like third world countries. It's just easier to produce drugs in these places. But because it has to be all off the books, none of these people could ever redress any of their grievances in court. Right, if I walked up to a police officer and I said, hey, that guy right there just ran off with my drugs, the officer's not going to go get my drugs back for me. If I had a contract with somebody to buy X number of drugs and they failed to meet that contract or in some way altered the contract without my consent, obviously, then I could go to court and say, hey, look, these people owe me this amount of money for this reason. Or if they, sell me bad drugs, I could, go and say, hey, look, these people poisoned me. But absolutely none of that could happen. And so what happens is that people end up getting shot, and once it's a culture of, murdering people is okay, then it becomes a gang culture where, killers move to the top very quickly. And this is all created because of a U.S. policy against drugs that most Americans obviously seem to want to do because we're buying so many drugs, right? It's like I said before, it's just this pretending idea that drugs are these terrible, awful things that we have to outlaw, yet we buy billions and billions of dollars of them every year. And so here again, we could just look to policies within the empire that wreak havoc on countries across the globe, and just unintended consequences of laws. Always love to point them out. All right, thanks everybody for listening. If you could please like the show, share the show, social media, Twitter, Facebook, whatever you got, whatever you could do, it would be really helpful in getting the show to grow. I do have exciting news that the show went over 2,000 downloads total. I believe that happened on Wednesday, so I was pretty pumped about that. Thanks everybody for reading my article. I got a lot of good feedback on that. If anybody hasn't, it's on libertarianinstitute.org. I wrote it with Will Porter. It's in the article section. It's linked on Foreign Policy Focus 38. Follow me on Twitter at KYAAALE, and like my Facebook page, Kyle's Files, Files spelled F-Y-L-E-S. I am going to try to get a little bit more active on social media and get more news out to more people, not only with my podcast, but just by tweeting and sharing articles and trying to post some cool stuff. So hopefully everybody could like my pages there and share some of the stuff I'm putting out, because I'm going to try to put some more work into it. The page for the podcast is foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. My website is kylesfilesblog.com, and I went on with Bloods way too long, so I'm sure nobody's listening. But if you are, have a good weekend, and I will be back on Monday.